It was supposed to be a normal weekend, one of those perfect evenings where you light up the fire pit, grab some cold drinks, and relax with friends in the backyard. After all, it was my property, right? A place where I should have been able to enjoy myself without anyone interfering. But that peace, it was shattered by an unexpected call. And not just from anyone, no, from HOAKaren. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Karen before, the entitled neighbor who thinks they can control everything, right? Well, this Karen wasn't just any normal HOAKaren. She was about to get a lesson in revenge. But let's back up a little, so you understand how it all began. It started on a Friday evening, a typical one. The sun was setting, the air was cool, and I had the perfect setup in my backyard. My fire pit was roaring. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and friends were gathered around with their drinks. The vibe was perfect. We were talking, laughing, and just enjoying a relaxing evening. But little did I know that our peaceful evening was about to be interrupted by Margaret, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the HOAKaren. Now, I didn't think much of her when she first moved in. She seemed pleasant enough, but after a few weeks, I started noticing something strange. She was always watching. You'd look out your window and find her staring over the fence, making sure you were following the rules. And don't get me started on the HOA meetings. Every time something went wrong in the neighborhood, Margaret had a list of complaints that seemed to focus only on one thing: me. She didn't like my garden. It was too wild for her tastes. She didn't like the color of my fence. She didn't like the placement of my mailbox. And you guessed it, she certainly didn't like my fire pit. I'll be honest, I didn't see the harm in having a fire pit. We live in a quiet neighborhood with plenty of space, and my fire pit was positioned away from the house, with no real danger to anyone. It wasn't huge. It wasn't a bonfire. It was a simple setup that allowed me to enjoy some evenings with friends or family. But to Margaret, apparently, it was a nuisance. She didn't want anyone to have any fun unless it was her kind of fun. So, on that particular Friday evening, when the fire pit was crackling and the conversation was flowing, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a knock on the door. I opened it, and there she was, standing with her hands on her hips like she was some kind of neighborhood police officer. "Your fire pit is too loud," she said, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "I can't sleep with that smoke, and it's disturbing the peace. I'm calling the cops." I blinked, stunned. I had no idea what to say. The fire wasn't even big. The smoke wasn't bothering anyone. But it wasn't about reason for her. It was about control. This was the same woman who had complained about my trees being too tall, or my sidewalk not being clean enough. "You're calling the cops?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. "Oh, yes," she replied. "And if you don't put that fire out, I'll make sure the HOA finds you for it too. You can't just have fires whenever you feel like it." With that, she turned and walked off, likely to call the authorities about the most ridiculous complaint she could think of. I could already feel my blood boiling. How dare she? I stood there for a few minutes, just in disbelief. Margaret, the one who had always found something to complain about, was now calling the cops on me for enjoying a fire in my own backyard. I couldn't believe it. And to make matters worse, the idea that the HOA might find me over this was the last straw. This wasn't just a neighborly nuisance anymore. It was an all-out attack on my right to live peacefully. And then it hit me. Why let her win? Why let this Karen think she could control my every move? This wasn't just about me. It was about standing up for every person who's ever had an HOAKaren try to ruin their day. I thought, if she's going to call the cops over a fire pit, I was going to give her something that would make her regret ever getting involved in my life. I wasn't going to put out my fire. No. I was going to build a massive bonfire. Right there, in front of her house. Right in front of her window. A fire so big, so epic, that the entire neighborhood would know exactly who she was messing with. I'll tell you, I was fired up, pun intended. That evening, I got to work. I knew I had to make this thing huge. I gathered more firewood than I had ever seen in my life. Old pallets, logs, branches, everything I could find. I wanted a bonfire that could not be ignored. But this wasn't just about the size of the fire. It was about showing Margaret that she couldn't control my life. As I built the fire, I could already feel the adrenaline kicking in. This was going to be the ultimate retaliation, a statement that would make Margaret think twice before ever calling the cops on me again. I wasn't just building a fire, I was building a monument to defiance. And then came the moment of truth. The fire was roaring, the flames shooting up high into the air, creating a wall of heat. It was so big I thought it might catch the nearby trees on fire. Don't worry, I kept a hose nearby just in case. But I wasn't done. The fire was still growing, and I could hear sirens in the distance. That's right, the cops were on their way. But instead of being afraid, I stood there with a smirk on my face. I didn't have any intention of letting them extinguish it. I was ready for them. As the fire grew higher, the neighbors started coming out of their homes. Some of them stared in awe, others seemed shocked, not knowing what to think. Margaret's house was right across the street, and I could see her through the window, standing there watching with a look of disbelief on her face. I felt a rush of satisfaction. But then, the sirens grew louder, and I could see the flashing lights in the distance. The cops were almost here. The flashing lights grew brighter as the police car pulled up in front of my house. I could see Margaret peeking through her window, trying to hide the excitement on her face, probably hoping for the cops to shut me down. But she didn't realize what was about to unfold. The officers stepped out of their car, looking confused at the sight of the massive bonfire I had built right in front of her house. I could see the surprise on their faces as they approached me. One officer, a tall guy with a buzz cut, stepped forward and raised his hand. "Hey, sir, we got a call about a disturbance. You're burning quite a big fire here." I smiled at him and pointed towards Margaret's house. "Well, officer, this fire is a response to someone who called the cops on me for having a small fire pit in my backyard earlier tonight. Now, I thought I'd give them a bigger show. If you're going to call the cops, you might as well make it worth it, right?" The officer looked at the bonfire, then back at me, trying to gauge whether I was serious. "Look, you're not supposed to have a fire this big in a residential area. It could be a fire hazard." I nodded, playing it cool. "I get it, officer. I've got water ready if anything goes wrong. I just thought I'd give my neighbor a real spectacle, since they had the police involved over something this small. You know, a little show of force to match their complaint." The officer seemed to understand the situation, but was still skeptical. He radioed in to get confirmation about any fire hazard regulations, while the other cops stood nearby, watching the flames. As the minutes passed, I could see Margaret getting more and more frustrated through her window. She was pacing, arms crossed, probably regretting that she'd ever involved the police in this whole ordeal. I wasn't backing down. This was my property, and if she wanted to get ridiculous, I'd make sure she remembered it. Finally, the officer came back to me. "All right, we've checked the regulations. You're right. It's not a fire hazard as long as you keep it under control. But you'll need to keep an eye on it, and it'd be better to put it out before it gets too late." I looked at the officer, smiled, and said, "I'll keep an eye on it. No problem, but I think the point has been made." The officers exchanged a look and seemed to understand that the situation wasn't worth escalating. They didn't want to get involved in a neighbor dispute that was just a matter of principle. So they left, reminding me to keep the fire under control, but they didn't force me to put it out. And just like that, I had won. Not with violence or anger, but with a statement. Margaret must have been watching, because I saw her pull away from the window, likely retreating to her couch, defeated. I had taken her attempt to ruin my evening and turned it into the most epic retaliation possible. The fire continued to burn well into the night, and neighbors began to gather around, chatting and joking about what had just happened. It was like a neighborhood block party, but the guest of honor was defiance. The best part? Margaret never came outside to complain again. In fact, for weeks after that night, she avoided even looking in my direction. The HOA didn't dare bother me either. Everyone in the neighborhood had seen what had happened, and even if they didn't all approve of the way I handled it, they respected the fact that I stood up for myself. It wasn't just about the fire pit or the bonfire. It was about taking back control from someone who thought they could dictate how I lived. And as for Margaret, well, she never bothered me again. She probably realized that messing with people like me wasn't worth it. The bonfire eventually burned down to embers, but the lesson it taught me would stay with me forever. Don't let anyone push you around. especially not over something as ridiculous as a backyard fire. Sometimes, standing your ground and going big is the only way to make a point. And trust me, it works. So, if you've ever had a Karen trying to ruin your fun or tell you how to live, take a note from my book. Turn the tables and make your point in the most epic way possible. I promise you'll feel a whole lot better. If you've ever had a crazy neighbor like mine or dealt with an HOA Karen, hit that like button and let me know in the comments how you handled it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where I take on the Karens of the world and show you how to win big. Thanks for watching.